Hey everybody, one of the best vantage points of all of Puget Sound has got to be the top of Green Mountain. Rainier, the Olympics, and even Seattle can be seen from what is one of two of the tallest peaks in all of the Kitsap Peninsula. But how did they get here? And did you know that while we call them Green and Gold Mountain, their names are actually the Blue Hills? We're going to tell you all that and more on this first edition of Tales of the Sound. Stay with us. Josh Farley from the Kitsap Sun here. Some of you know this view well, but what you probably don't know is that we look at these two peaks about 1,700 feet in height, Green and Gold Mountain, and they're actually collectively known as the Blue Hills. They're named so because of the color they give to viewers on the east side of the sound, where the blur of the lines of the sky and the sound tint the landscape. So while these mountains might not be as tall as, say, the Olympics to the west or the Cascades to the east, there's plenty of advantages with this kind of height. For years in the 20th century, a fire watch stood guard over these entire forested lands. There's still emergency communications equipment that is dispatched from Gold Mountain. But how did a peninsula with so much coastline end up with these hills, our biggest little mountain range? For the answer, we have to travel back in time millions of years. Micah Kipple is a Kitsap native and geology grad from Central Washington University who helped create the first and only database for waterfalls on the Kitsap Peninsula. In short, he is a rock nerd. Micah took us to a nearby rock quarry to show us what we're made of. We being Kitsap, that is.
The Blue Hills and Golden Green Mountain are a mass of rock that was erupted onto the seafloor 50 million years ago when this area looked a lot different than it does today. The Olympic Mountains didn't exist, Puget Sound didn't exist. The coastline where we would see it at the Olympic Peninsula today was actually at where present-day Seattle is. So Golden Green Mountains is a huge mass of lava that was erupted onto the ocean floor approximately 50 million years ago. After what's known as the accretion of Silesia, where the actual rocks that make up the Blue Hills and Golden Green Mountain were slammed and added to the side of the North American continent. Starting about 2 million years ago to 16,000 years ago, the Puget Sound and the whole Northwest was inundated with ice repeatedly. Large tongues or lobes of ice coming into the Puget Sound area. And this ice, where we're standing here just off of Gold Creek Road, was over 2,000 to 3,000 feet thick. So it overrode the top of Golden Green Mountains. So maybe prior to the ice coming in, these peaks were more jagged or rugged, kind of like the Eastern Olympics look on the horizon today. But after being overridden by that ice and the grinding erosive power of that ice, they took on the more round topography that we see today.
In the millennia since, the Blue Hills have stood like sentinels over Puget Sound until more than a century ago when settlers sought to tap into these natural resources. Some were a fool's errand. For instance, a story in the Charleston Record in 1905 recalls the development of something called the Wildcat Lake Tin Mining Company. A Seattle businessman named Frank Simmons thought that he had found tin in them thar hills. He dug a 300-foot shaft into the ground and planned to build a railroad all the way from here to Bremerton. But when Simmons sampled the potential product, the story goes, it was apparently of no value. But the name stuck on a trail and a nearby creek. Gold was panned too in these hills, but there was apparently not enough for a profitable operation, especially when gold was struck in Klondike in 1898, sending those wishing to strike it rich towards Alaska instead, according to Kitsap County, a history. The most ubiquitous, tried and true asset to this day, though, is of course the vast timber that we have here all over Puget Sound, and the Blue Hills are no exception. Today, Green Mountain is filled with a wide variety of flora and fauna. I talked with environmental studies professor Amy Lawrence about what you can expect to find here.
It's home to like the iconic, Douglas fir. It's probably the most obvious evergreen tree that you'd see when you go out there with its pretty deeply grooved bark, and it's always green. It's an evergreen. It is a great place to see in early to mid-May our native Pacific rhododendron, which is our state flower. And there's lots of those, especially in the areas that have a little more sun. Other plants that you might see is western red cedar, which is another of our iconic evergreen trees, with the peely bark. It's pretty identifiable that way.
Much of Kitsap County was logged in the early 20th century. Today, under the jurisdiction of the state's Department of Natural Resources, portions of the 6,000 acres of Green Mountain it maintains are logged, and the proceeds from those harvests fund the construction of things like public schools, as well as provide funding to counties and state universities. The state also leases communication towers on Gold Mountain, technically the taller of the two mountains by a whopping 122 feet. Television is broadcast, and critical emergency responder communications are still routed from its peak. A weather Doppler happens to still sit on the mountain, but it was damaged by falling ice, putting a big dent in its side. But just as forests can be logged, they can also be burned. Fire lookouts date back into the 1920s here. It's believed that they were completed at the top of the vista, including a 97-foot tower that stood for much of the 20th century. They were needed structures. For instance, a massive fire of more than 3,000 acres in the nearby Bremerton watershed property in 1938 made it even more of a priority. And during World War II, the vista was used as an anti-aircraft warning station, keeping an eye out should the Axis powers attempt an attack of the American mainland, namely the Puget Sound Naval Shipyard. In 1957, at the nearby headwaters of the Union River, the city of Bremerton opened a dam that today serves the drinking water of almost a third of all Kitsap County residents. Today, these trails are favorites among locals for great hiking.
And as I had to adult more and had more responsibilities, had to find local trails because I wanted to stay. I didn't have time to take a full day to go hiking. And that's when I learned about Green Mountain and the local trails around here. And Green Mountain's become a favorite of mine because of all the different trails, and there's so many things to explore here.
I have a running group out here. It's not mine. It's a conglomerate thing. It's really awesome. For the Evergreen Turtle Rockets, it's an awesome name. We've done a lot of work with DNR, and I think it's been a really great way for me to network and for our running group to network with the mountain bikers and the backcountry horsemen and some of the moto people and the mountaineers, to get all these groups together. And it's really nice to have all these different user groups who use Green Mountain together for one purpose and kind of cleaning up trails.
In fact, DNR is spending $700,000 to not only enhance the current trails, but build new ones and improve the summit where you go and take in all of Puget Sound. The Gold Creek Trailhead is probably the easiest way to get to the top, although it's still a 2-mile hike. You can also access it via a longer route at Wildcat Lake. Thanks for watching the first edition of Tales of the Sound. We hope you enjoyed it. Email any feedback to me, Josh Farley, at josh.farley@kitsapsun.com. See you next time.